I wonder if you've been in the same situation as I have, where you've got some 12-volt batteries or some 24-volt batteries for your DIY solar system, and you've been using it just fine. But over time, as you've been using your batteries, you might have noticed that, especially when you buy standard batteries, like the ones I'm using for my DIY solar system, typically they don't come with battery monitors and ways to measure their battery capacity right off the box. You've got to install one of them yourself. So that's what we'll be looking at in this video. I have a battery monitor with a shunt, which I got from the brand REDODO, and I'll be giving you my full review and also installation guide on how to install one of these. Why would you want to get one? What are the differences between using a lead acid battery monitor versus a lithium ion battery monitor? Some of the pros and cons of this specific battery monitor. There are a couple of disclaimers I want to mention before we get into the details of this video. There are a lot of different brands doing their own version of battery monitors, and in my opinion, they all kind of roughly do the same job, which is basically to track how much amperage is leaving and also entering into the batteries. And then once the battery monitor is correctly calibrated, it means that you can track the actual capacity that you have remaining with your batteries. The nice thing right off the bat with this battery monitor from REDODO is it's rated up to 500 amps, which means that you can have a very large system connected to this battery monitor and the shunt. The second disclaimer, which would be important to note, is that personally, I would consider myself as a DIY solar enthusiast. Personally, I'm not like a licensed electrician or anything, so just keep that in mind whenever you're seeing my installations. I'm just doing this for culminating my experience as the average individual learning how to install one of these, and actually it's came out really well. So even just for the learning experience, I already recommend going for one of these devices. And actually, generally DIY solar, you learn so much about electrics and building your own system compared to just buying a power station where you don't learn any of that. You just buy it and it's all pre-made. The DIY experience, you really learn a lot about how to do it yourself. So that's already one of the big plus sides. So the first question probably to answer is, why would you want to get one of these battery monitors in the first place? Obviously, as the name implies, a battery monitor simply monitors the current state of charge, the SOC, of the battery that you're monitoring. When you use a battery monitor for a lead acid battery, usually they're quite cheap, and all they do is they just monitor the voltage. So depending on, like, if it's at 50%, the battery of the lead acid battery voltage will slightly decrease and it'll slowly go down. Now, with lithium iron phosphate batteries, it's harder to use that metric, the voltage, to measure the SOC, the state of charge. And the reason being is because the voltage stays higher, whether you're at like 20% or 80%, you could be at 13 volts or 13.4 volts, whether you're at 20% or 80% capacity. So this is one of the reasons why it's better to use a battery monitor with a shunt rather than trying to measure with the voltage, the current voltage of the battery. That being said, it's not that you can't use voltage as an estimate for your SOC, it's just that shunts are usually way more accurate. Keep in mind that shunts are not the only way to measure the state of charge of a battery. You can also use a Hall sensor, and it's kind of like an amp clamp meter, but instead it's fixed and it goes around the cable. But usually shunts are more accurate than using a Hall sensor. I did get a Hall sensor in the mail recently, so I am thinking to maybe do a comparison in the future. So let's jump into the review of this specific battery monitor from REDODO. I would say that it was relatively easy to install once you follow the guide and the manual that comes with the battery monitor, and that is one of the plus sides, is that the guide that comes with it is definitely very clear and actually really easy to follow. Personally, I like the build quality of the battery monitor. I really like the fact that the cable that comes with it, which connects to the shunt and then goes all the way up to the battery monitor, it's super long, is 6 meters long, so 20 feet in length, and it's a shielded wire. It also comes with a small little screwdriver because there are some very small screws that you need to attach the power wire so that you can run the shunt. You also get some mounting screws so you can decide whether you want to mount that onto the wall, if you want to mount the actual shunt. The display that comes with this battery monitor is really easy to read. The settings is not complicated to get into. You basically just hold down the bottom button in the corner. So on the display, we get all sorts of different parameters. We can see the current that's leaving the battery. We can see how much of the state of capacity we've got in amp hours. We've got the percentage, time remaining, present voltage of the batteries. Again, it's excellent build quality. The shunt is very sturdy and strong. It definitely feels like it's high quality in my opinion. And it definitely feels like you could put quite a high amperage through it because it's really quite a hefty device, which is really good. And another big plus side to using the shunt which comes with this battery monitor is that shunts in general, they are usually the most reliable and the most accurate way to measure the amount of current coming in and out of the battery. And what's really cool is that it measures everything that's coming in and out, including if you wire it correctly, you can measure how much power is also coming into the batteries at the same time. So definitely there's some really big pros to using a battery monitor like this. So when it comes to installation, I'm going to try my best to explain it as simply as I can, step by step. First thing to mention is you might need to give yourself a full afternoon for installation, but again, that kind of depends on who you are. And if you're a beginner when it comes to installing this, you're going to need to give yourself a full afternoon. I should probably mention right off the bat that one thing that you could do to simplify the installation is you might want to think about getting some M8 bolts for the shunt. That might help simplify the installation. But just keep in mind, if you do that, you're going to be reducing the amount of current that you can put through the shunt, because this battery monitor uses M10 bolts for its standard because it can handle a very high amount of amperage. And most cables for solar setups use the M8 as the standard. So you have two options. You can either buy some pre-made custom cables, or you can go down the route of making your own custom cables yourself. I decided to do this, and it actually was relatively easy to do. I can highly recommend doing it just for the learning experience. I will leave a link down below to the crimping kit that I decided to use. The only thing that is that for the lugs, you might want to buy 2 or 3 M10 lugs, which will fit corresponding to the cable that you're going to use. And you can use this as a reference for installing your own, but just keep in mind, everybody's setup might be a little bit different here and there, but you can use my setup and my installation as a rough guide on how to install yours. And before we begin, also make sure that there's no power going into your solar charge controller and that you've disconnected your battery from the solar charge controller. Now let's move on to looking at the wire diagram for reference on how to install this. I think this is probably the best place to start. I've got a screenshot here of the wire diagram, which is actually included in the manual. And as you can see, it's actually very clearly marked on where everything goes. As you can see, the shunt will basically sit on the negative side of the cable, not the positive side. And as you can see, we're basically going to be connecting up the MPPT charge controller to the shunt. We're going to be connecting up the inverter to the shunt. I also have a DC controller box, which I also connected up to the shunt. The B- symbol, we connect that to the battery. And then the P- symbol is for the MPPT charge controller and the inverter. And make sure that when you tighten these bolts down, they need to be pretty tight, not excessive, but just enough to handle the thermal expansion. And then finally, as you can see, the power line going to run the shunt is this tiny little terminal. And then that basically connects up to an O-ring terminal that sits on the battery. Now that setup, as you can see on the diagram, is for a single battery. If you're setting up batteries in parallel, it'll be slightly different, but it's pretty much the same setup. The only difference is that you'll start to use bus bars so that you can handle having more connections connected up. A bus bar in this context just basically allows me to connect more O-ring terminals to the shunt. Now that we've looked at the wire diagram, which personally helped me tremendously on visualizing how to install it, I decided to use the negative wire that came with my inverter. It was a good enough thickness to handle the currents, and that allowed me to connect up the shunt to the bus bar, and also then another line which went up to the negative terminal on my battery. So I cut it into 3 lengths. You can choose what you want to do. You might only need to cut it into 2 pieces. That's probably the bare minimum. If you don't want to cut your wire, then you'll have to buy some pre-made cables wherever you're based in the world, where you can get M8 to M10. Make sure that whenever you're buying the lugs, that you try and get lugs which are for sure the M10 standard, because the M8 and M10 look very similar. And then with those 3 individual pieces, I made up cables that fit according to the shunt and the bus bar. So I had 1 length of cable with an M8 lug and another M10 lug on that end. Then on the other 2 cables, I had M8 going to M10, and this is so that we can connect it up to the shunt. Once you've crimped all your cables, you can start wiring everything. Now, honestly, you can just use the manual that comes with it as a rough guide on how to follow step by step. You can kind of choose what you feel is more convenient for your situation. I personally, because of the tight space I was working with, I decided to connect up my shunt power line first. Then I started to connect up the negative wire from the inverter to the shunt, which again, you need to make sure that you follow the symbols that are marked on the battery, which correspond with the manual. Then you can start to add your negative line, which comes from your charge controller to the bus bar, which is, again, how I decided to set it up. You could connect this line directly to the shunt if you want to. And then I have a DC controller box, which also sits on that shunt as well for the negative line. Then all the positive lines I connect up to the positive terminal on the battery. Once you've followed the wire diagram correctly, you can then connect up your batteries to the charge controller. Personally, I made sure to discharge my batteries all the way down to 0. Now, both of these batteries, basically, roughly, they get down to 10.8 volts, which is that it's at 0%. Then once you've done that, you then leave the batteries for about half an hour to really make sure that they're at absolute 0. Once you've connected everything back up to the charge controller, before you let power come in from your solar panels, we want to make sure that the display is calibrated for 0%. Once you've gone into settings and you've chosen what your batteries get up to on full voltage and then battery capacity is, there's 0 voltage as well. You can then go back to the main screen. You then hold the down arrow and it'll calibrate itself for 0%. Once the device is all calibrated at 0% and you're seeing that your batteries are at a very low voltage, which is perfectly normal, you can then allow power to start coming in, and you'll notice that the percentage will start to rise as amperage starts coming in. You could also do this the other way around if you prefer, to calibrate this device from 100%, which is definitely a little bit easier than starting from 0 because it takes a lot less longer to set up. All you do is, once you've got 2 of these flat batteries or a flat battery, you basically allow the device to just keep charging. Then on the display, you will then notice that if you've got a nice bright sunny day, you might be getting 300, 400, 500 watts. And you'll notice that the amperage and the wattage will start to taper off almost to 0. Once it stays at 0 amperage where no more amperage is coming in, and you leave it like that for about an hour or 2, then you can safely assume that your batteries are 100%. And all you have to do is hold the up arrow and it will calibrate the device for 100%. And then you've successfully calibrated your battery monitor. You can either calibrate it from 100% or you could calibrate it from 0%. 0% might be a little bit more accurate. Just keep that in mind. Now let's move on to some of the constructive feedback that I'd like to see on a future model, perhaps, of this battery monitor. Perhaps in the future, I'd like to see a 300 amp version, which uses M8 bolts as the standard, because right now, currently, REDODO are only offering a 500 amp version, which means you're going to have to use M10 bolts. Another thing I would like to see in the future is possibly having a Bluetooth function on a battery monitor like this, because it would be really useful to be able to use your phone to connect up to this device. And currently this version is just a standard model. All of the information that you want to see is accessible only via the display that comes with it. Again, really good display, very clear, very easy to operate, very easy to see. For the next video, you can have a look at one of my battery reviews. I've also done a review on one of their mini batteries, and I've also done a review on their 230 volt, 2000 watt inverter. And I also have a beginner's guide for installing a DIY solar system. Definitely stay subscribed for future videos. Don't forget to like the video, and I hope to see you in a future video.